Hello again, everyone, and welcome back to Reddit Aliens. I am John, and as always, thank you so much for being here. A good topic? Let's do it. Pilots of Reddit. What has been a scary situation while flying that the passengers were blissfully unaware of? Please remember to like, share, and subscribe.
I'm an airline captain based out of LAX. A little late to the party here, but this is a good story that meets the criteria for this post. On a commercial aircraft, you generally have three sources of bleed air that take air from the engines and a little device in the back of the airplane called the APU, and use it to pressurize the cabin. You can't breathe the air at 35,000 feet, so the cabin is pressurized by these bleed air sources to a breathable altitude of at or below 8,000 feet. There are three sources because 1. Redundancy increases safety, and 2. You can still dispatch the airplane is one in-op because there are backups. One of the bleed sources on the number 2 engine was already broken, so maintenance deferred it, indicating we were still safe to fly on the remaining 2 sources, which is totally fine. You just take off with the APU running as a backup bleed source. Well, on the takeoff roll, immediately after becoming airborne, our APU fails, which leaves us with just one bleed source to pressurize the cabin. The bleed air from the number 1 engine, if that fails, we have nothing to keep the air inside the cabin pressurized to a lower altitude than the airplane is flying at. You won't be able to breathe at high altitudes. It's a short flight, and we aren't going up too high, so I'm optimistic that we can get up to our low cruising altitude, message dispatch and maintenance, and receive their agreement that the flight is safe to continue on one bleed source. I text our company a message describing the situation via ACARS, a satellite-based texting capability our aircraft has to communicate with people on the ground, but they never had a chance to get back to us. Passing through 25,000 feet, I feel the air getting sucked out of my lungs. I'm trying to inhale, but it isn't working, and my lungs are emptying quickly. Unable to breathe normally, immediately my eyes shoot to the cabin altitude gauge, which is showing us at 8,000 feet cabin altitude and rising quickly. In fact, it's rising at the exact same rate of climb as our airplane, indicating the airplane has lost all pressurization capabilities and is depressurizing rapidly. At that instant, we get a warning chime and message on our ICAS, Engine Information and Crew Alerting System, essentially a computer screen that tells us when shit goes wrong, that says Bleed 1 failed. With our Bleed 1 source now failed, our APU having failed in the takeoff roll, and Bleed 2 already deferred, we are completely out of ways to pressurize the aircraft. If we don't descend to a safe altitude immediately, the cabin altitude will rise high enough that the air is no longer breathable. This is a serious problem. High cabin altitude killed everyone on board Helios Airways Flight 522, and there are countless other examples of depressurization causing injuries and fatalities. Immediately, I throw off my sunglasses and headset and don my full-face oxygen mask and smoke goggles. It provides 100% pure oxygen under a forced flow, rated up to an altitude of 41,000 feet. My first officer does the same. This is the first thing you do because if the pilots die, there's nobody to fly the jet and everyone else dies. Then we immediately declare an emergency and initiate an emergency descent, nosing over to our maximum speed while deploying the speed brakes to generate maximum drag. We receive clearance down to 10,000 feet and begin executing a 180-degree turn to go back to LAX. ATC does a fantastic job vectoring aircraft out of our way. SoCal airspace is some of the busiest in the world, but we got priority handling all the way back to LAX. The cabin altitude nearly reached hazardous levels, but didn't go high enough for the oxygen masks in the cabin to automatically deploy. It was definitely high enough that the passengers would have noticed, but wouldn't have had a concrete idea of what was going on aside from, "That's odd." The cabin also got quite hot because there was no more pressurized conditioned air flowing to cool it off. We landed at LAX on the longest runway, with fire trucks rolled to assist us, just in case. Fortunately, none of the passengers or crew reported any injuries from the sudden increase in cabin altitude. We parked at the gate and deplaned, and I made an announcement to the passengers about what had just happened, using small words and downplaying everything so as not to scare the shit out of everyone. 12 Chinese passengers on our flight were on a West Coast tour, and they were very upset that their trip was inconvenienced by this emergency. No problem, I totally understand the frustration. So I spoke to their translator, who spoke in turn to her group, and I gave her the full and very detailed explanation of what happened. As I explained what happened, the expressions on these 12 passengers' faces went from angry to surprised to fearful, and finally thankful. Before I walked away, all 12 of them bowed to me in respect. That was something I've never experienced before or since then in my entire aviation career. We ended up swapping airplanes to one that wasn't sick, and completed the flight as planned about 3 hours behind schedule. I slept well that night, and the passengers probably went on to complain about their flight being delayed several hours due to a maintenance issue. Flocks of birds like to appear out of the grass when rolling down a runway for takeoff. It happens a lot more than passengers would like to know, but usually it's a non-event. Every once in a while, though, that flock will appear right in front of us near rotation speed, and we just hope they're gone by the time we get moving through that space. I had just received my private pilot license and was flying around the area with my dad in a rented C-172. We had landed at a local airport to stop and use the restroom, get something to drink, etc. Well, in my noobish excitement, I had never retracted the flaps after landing. Didn't notice before taking off again. First sign of an issue was that the plane wanted to lift off much earlier than it should. I should have taken this as a cue that something was wrong, but I did not. I let the plane dictate what I was doing despite knowing something was off. We started to climb out. I finally noticed the flaps were at full. I immediately reached down and lifted the lever to fully retract them. That was my next mistake. The plane was now rapidly losing lift, and I began to sink back down ominously close to the trees at the end of the runway. I flipped the lever back down to about halfway to stop the flaps from retracting further. This stopped my sink, and I was able to gain some speed and resume climbing. When I was clear in the air, I finished retracting the flaps. My dad was completely unaware that I about flew us into some trees because I made a stupid rookie mistake. I didn't do the proper checks before takeoff. Furthermore, I let the plane dictate my actions despite knowing something wasn't right. I use that as a lesson in the future to never skip safety checks. A little off topic, but as a passenger on a flight from LAX to the main island of Hawaii on the United Flight 83, I plugged my earbuds into the armrest and found the channel that let you listen to the pilots talking to the tower. About 100 miles out, they were getting in line and the tower called us United 93. I got a cold chill. The pilots murmured. The tower called back referring to us as United 83, and everything moved along. I could just tell that anyone involved with that conversation just felt sick. Probably will get buried, but whatever. I was giving a ride to a friend in a rental Cessna 172F. It was late in the day and the sun was going down. The airport I was heading to was only about 15 nautical miles away, but it was on the other side of a large body of water. We taxi up to the run-up pad and I test the engine like I do before every flight. Everything seems to look fine and normal. I taxi onto the runway, make my final checks, and proceed to take off. At that point, I detect a small, unusual vibration. I brushed it off like it was nothing. Small, old airplanes vibrate all the time, so it's no surprise. As I'm climbing out, I'm looking at the tachometer, and I glance down at the oil pressure, and it's measuring lower than normal. I decide to turn base into an upwind, pilot talk for turnaround while still in airport airspace, for the departure airport rather than riding it out over the lake. We're at about 1700 MSL, 800 feet AGL, when the oil pressure falls below allowable limits. At this point, I'm freaking out in my head because shit gets going real fast. My passenger doesn't know anything is up because I'm not saying anything. The last thing I need is some guy freaking the hell out while I'm trying to land the plane without a usable engine. I calmly tell him we need to turn around. My assumption is that I'm pissing oil and I'm at risk of fire, so I get on the Unicom, airport radio frequency, and declare an emergency landing. The others in the pattern exit, and I end up doing right traffic to final. I pull the throttle to prevent any fire as I turn base to final while keeping enough airspeed to keep from stalling and crashing. I ended up doing the approach too fast and landed the airplane on the last 500 feet of the runway, nearly running off the end. I pulled to the taxiway and shut the engine down. Turns out the engine was grinding and making metal on the inside. Probably first time I was thankful for how excellent my instructors were when I was training. DR. Lost my engine during takeoff, saved the airframe, and my passenger had no goddamn clue what was going on. Not a pilot, but I was a passenger when I overheard a flight attendant speaking to another saying, "They're gonna try flying over it." Shortly after the pilot announced we would be experiencing some turbulence from a nearby storm. They weren't kidding. That shit hit the plane so hard we had to make an emergency landing in Louisiana. Apparently some electronics were damaged, so we had to switch planes. Haven't flown in a few years, but I had my PPL for a couple of years and only had a few incidents worthy of a story. On my second ever solo, while I was still a student pilot, I hit a pocket of air right after takeoff that threw my head into the ceiling hard enough to make me a little dizzy. Never told anyone about that. First trip home after getting my PPL, I was taxiing the plane to park and nearly took out a fence while my parents were watching me. I acted like I meant to get the wing within inches of it when my dad brought up how close I was. One time I had a guy in a helicopter completely cut in front of me right after I was given clearance to take off. I just pushed the throttle in, so it wasn't really close, but the best part of it was hearing the traffic controller lose his shit on the heli pilot. I miss flying. For anyone who's curious, there's an interesting series called Mayday Air Crash Investigation, which details many of the terrible crashes and accidents over the years. I have a terrible fear of flying, but honestly, seeing these and how they corrected the issues has helped me to get over it. So many safety issues were corrected and created to solve the problems over the years, but some of them still just horrify me. A few of my college roommates were commercial pilot majors. It was not uncommon to be woken up on a Saturday and told we're flying 6 states away today. One particular time, I remember being about 10,000 feet over the Mississippi River when my friend Paul says, "Hey, look at that," just before stalling the engine and falling 1,000 feet in a matter of seconds. All the while, he's fighting the choke, and I watched as the propeller stopped. It is not a good feeling to have been flying for 3 hours with the constant roar of the plane engine not 4 feet in front of you, to sudden engine silence and the deafening roar of wind going by as you are falling hundreds of feet per second. Freaked the F out of me. But apparently restarting a stalled aircraft is something you must do to get a license. He did it 3 more times that day. Military pilot here. Can't speak for my commercial bros, but most things that break are minor, and for the more serious shit, your pilot is more than overqualified to handle it. From my experience sharing airspace with the bus drivers, most airliners will take precautions to make sure a bad situation, though minor, doesn't get worse. I.e., my buddy's flight across the pond came back for a bad smell in the cockpit. Maybe something is burning, maybe somebody had a particularly acrid fart, who knows? Most times my crew is unaware of the particulars of how close we came to smashing that bird I narrowly avoided. Could count the feathers on that effort. Not a pilot, but I do work for an airline. I was doing a project at our base at LaGuardia and had to fly home to my native Indianapolis, and my only option was to deadhead with a few crew members from my airline back home. I was sitting by myself in first class on an empty plane, save for 1 pilot, 3 flight attendants, plus the 2 guys flying the plane. Upon landing, we hit the runway really hard and bounced. I didn't think anything of it, as I've flown on airplanes hundreds of times. However, the captain flying the plane looked white as a ghost, and he told me he almost flipped us. Not a pilot, but I was once a passenger on a particularly scary landing in New Orleans. We were flying through the darkest, scariest rainstorm I could imagine, with a lot of turbulence. It was scary enough that we just seemed to keep turning and turning, but I couldn't see the end of the wing out of the window due to the rain. When the wheels hit pavement and we started toward the gate, everyone started turning on their cell phones. It was like a great chorus went up as each one connected and immediately made the tornado alert sound. We'd landed during a tornado warning. Late to the game on this one, but I was a passenger on a pretty scary flight experience. I was coming back into LaGuardia from Florida late at night. Most of the people on the plane were asleep when the loudspeaker comes on and the pilot literally yells, "Everyone be seated and buckle up." That was it. Everyone was wide awake and the flight attendants were obviously rattled. Within 30 seconds, the plane nosedived, which is the worst feeling ever. This continued until we were mere feet above buildings in Atlantic City. I remember thinking, we could jump out on top of the Borgata and be fine. At this point, everyone is crying and on their phones, and the stewardesses are freaking out. Everyone thought the plane was hijacked as we were heading toward New York City. Of course, as luck would have it, we also landed on the runway at LaGuardia that is right on the edge of the water, and it looks like you're going to crash into the water. While we were pulling into the gate, the pilot finally came over the loudspeaker again, apologizing for the disturbing flight as the windshield shattered at 25,000 feet and they had to nosedive to avoid the cabin losing pressure. Scary shit.
That's pretty wild. I'm glad you guys made it out okay, and great job by those pilots to get everybody home safe. LaGuardia can be a freaky airport. I've landed there a bunch being from New York, because you do land right over the water almost every time. So if you ever fly to LaGuardia, it's pretty normal, but it can be a little unsettling.
I was a passenger on a flight last year, early 2016. Not sure from O'Hare to Miami or the other way around, daytime. I was sitting by the window on the left side behind the wing, decided to open the blind and take a look. The only thing I saw was this aircraft flight left to right below us. I saw it almost full size, so it couldn't have been too far below us. It freaked me out a little. I did not see any other passengers bothered to by the close flyby if anyone noticed. Probably the pilot saw it on the radar. I fly small single-engine general aviation aircraft, think Cessna 172s and whatnot. A few friends of mine decided to fly from our home city to Chicago to attend Lollapalooza 2011, if my memory is correct. The flight there was fine, no problems. But on the day we intended to fly back, there were your typical summertime isolated rain showers passing through the area. I decided to wait it out at the airport with hopes that it would clear up later in the afternoon. Afternoon turned into evening, and then I saw a break in the rain showers on the local radar, so I decided this was our opportunity to depart. I filed a flight plan, and we all got in the plane, did my checklists, and taxied for takeoff. Side note, at this time, I only had my private pilot's license. This means I'm allowed to fly even at night, so long as I'm in a visual meteorological conditions, VMC. Basically, the pilot needs to be able to see the ground and the sky around him or her to visually see the orientation of the aircraft and see and avoid other aircraft. She or he is not allowed to fly in the clouds and or by instruments alone. Back to the story. Soon after takeoff, we were cleared by ATC to fly on course at our desired altitude. Looking outside, I could see the lights of the Chicago suburbs, which provided a decent horizon and told me to a pretty good degree which way was down. But also, thanks to these lights, I could see that these clouds were far lower than predicted and forced us to stay low, below the cloud layer to maintain VMC. Things got worse fast. Heading away from the city meant the lights that previously provided some orientation started to disappear, and I soon found myself in a rain-producing cloud with no outside visual orientation whatsoever. FFF. I immediately reverted to my limited instrument training and used the aircraft instruments to keep the airplane oriented the way I wanted. I kept thinking 30 seconds, 30 seconds, as this was the amount of time they say it takes for a pilot with no instrument training to get themselves into a panic-inducing stall or spin once they found themselves in instrument meteorological conditions, IMC. My friend and I were all using headsets and in the same intercom system so they could hear everything I said, including my communication with ATC. I calmly got on the radio with ATC and said, "I need to return to the airport. Are you able to maintain VFR, visual flight rules?" They asked. "Yes," I responded, as I descended below the cloud deck and reversed course. In hindsight, I absolutely should have declared an emergency, but I didn't for the reason that my passengers would have heard the same and may have panicked. ATC gave me vectors, directions back to the airport where we landed and parked the plane. On getting out of the aircraft, I told my passengers, "F this, we're getting a hotel and leaving tomorrow." The next morning was severe clear and not a cloud in the sky. The flight back home was calm and uneventful. To this day, I don't think my passengers know how bad it could have gotten, and should it have gone another way, it would have entirely been my fault. I immediately committed to getting my instrument ratings, which I did soon after, but even after my IFR reading, I'm much more wary of get-there-itis, and I'll never again put myself and or my passengers in a position like that again. TL, DR. I flew myself and a few friends into a situation that was scary at least, and almost fatal at most. Sorry, typed on my phone.